So whenever I'm playing Ahri carry, the question comes up, is blue buff or Shojin better on Ahri? The short answer to that is that it really doesn't matter whether you build blue buff or Spear of Shojin specifically on Ahri, and we'll get into why in a little bit. Just so you guys know, on my website at bunnymuffins.lol, I just put out a new article where I tell you which item is better for every single champion, and I also include the traits such as Enlightened buff, which gives increased mana gain for each of those Enlightened champions, and I also go over the Sharpshooter buff and tell you which items are better for each champion in those specific scenarios as well. Then, after that list, I go over the assumptions of the tables, issues to consider if I list either as a recommendation, and I also go into how mana works. I'm going to cover all this in this video, as well as go over all the exceptions over here, but first let's go back to the Ahri question. So the way mana works is you gain mana after every auto attack and every time a unit takes damage. Since Ahri is mainly a backline unit, she doesn't take that much damage, so we're not going to factor in taking damage in these calculations right now. You should also note that every basic attack generates 10 mana per auto attack. First, looking at blue buff, after casting their initial spell, the wearer's mana is set to 20, and this item also gives 30 starting mana. All this is taken into account in all my calculations on the spreadsheet. As you can already guess, this item is very strong on champions with 30 or lower mana because then each champion will only take one auto attack to get their spell off. Champions such as Akali love this. Spear of Shojin is a great mana regeneration item as well, but it works a little differently. Spear of Shojin gives 15 attack damage and 15 starting mana, and the holder's basic attacks restore 5 mana on hit. So that means before, when we were looking at the basic attacks, instead of generating 10 mana per attack, you now generate 15 with Spear of Shojin. Back to Ahri, let's look at her stats. We see over here that Ahri starts with 0 mana and needs 80 mana to cast her spell. So without any items and without taking damage, Ahri takes 8 auto attacks in order to cast her first spell. Now for all her casts after the first spell, she'll also take 8 auto attacks since she'll start at 0 mana. This changes up once she gets blue buff. Ahri's starting mana with blue buff is 30, and then after that, since she gains 10 mana per auto attack, it'll take 5 auto attacks for the first cast. For her second cast, since blue buff sets her starting mana back to 20, she'll need 60 mana, which means that she needs 6 auto attacks for her second cast and every cast after that. Now let's take a look at Spear of Shojin. Spear of Shojin gives 15 mana, which makes her first cast require 65 mana. It takes 5 auto attacks to generate that amount of mana, even with the Spear of Shojin bonus of plus 5 mana per auto attack. So after her first auto attack, she'll have 30 mana, then 45, then 60, then 75, and then after that she'll have 80 out of 80. Now for her second cast, she starts at 0 mana, which means she'll require 80 mana to get the cast off, and that also takes 6 auto attacks similar to blue buff for her second and subsequent casts. A frequently asked question is, hey, in this composition I run both Ahri and Yuumi, and both of these guys give me the Spirit buff, which gives increased attack speed to my whole team. Doesn't that mean Spear of Shojin's always going to be better whenever you're playing Spirit? The answer to that is no. Attack speed does not matter at all for mana calculations if you are only looking at the number of auto attacks it takes for a champion to cast their spell. Let's go back into our calculations before and let's think about it. If you increase Ahri's attack speed by 5,000%, is Spear of Shojin going to cast faster than blue buff? The easy answer is no, because it takes the same amount of auto attacks in order to cast her spell. Attack speed literally has no bearing on cast speed when comparing these two items, so just keep that in mind as you watch the rest of the video. On the contrary, something that does matter is hitting the like button right below the video if you're enjoying what you're seeing so far, and if you are new to the channel and you want to see more of this type of content, go ahead and hit the subscribe button below as well. Let's get into the next topic, which is the chart. Let's dig deep into how this works and go into some of the exceptions. So I'm not going to go over every example, but let's dive a little deeper. Champions with very small mana pools, such as Akali, who has 30 mana, as we looked into before, is much better with blue buff. Typically, champions with a lot of mana, such as Aatrox, which needs 125 mana to cast a spell, generally prefer Spear of Shojin. And then around like the 50 to 80 mana mark, it's kind of a toss-up. But later we'll get into how to decide which one might be slightly better than the other based on different scenarios. Keep in mind, I also keep track of chosen units in this chart, so if you have a chosen Cassiopeia where her mana is reduced because of the chosen trait, I also denote which item is stronger on each of those champions. In the case of chosen Ezreal, where I list blue, Shojin, what this means is that blue buff is better if you want to get a faster first cast, and Shojin is better if you want to get a slower first cast, but faster second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. cast. Do keep in mind that first casts are generally more impactful to the game, but he might cast 3 times, in which case Shojin might be a tiny bit better in those instances. It depends on the game, depends what comp you're running, so you're just going to have to do that analysis yourself in each specific game. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's that much of a difference between either of these two items for those listed champions because we don't always get to choose what item we get at the end of the day. Next up, we have Irelia. Irelia is the same case as Ezreal. First cast is better with blue, second cast is better with Shojin, and then with the Enlighten buff, you want Shojin for 2 and 4 Enlighten, and you want blue buff if you have 6 Enlighten for Irelia. Next up, we look at Janna, and Janna, when she's alone with no Enlighten buff, she can use either item. And then with the Enlighten buff, blue buff is better at 2 Enlighten, and then either or for 4 and 6 Enlightened. Jinx, without Sharpshooter buff, is much better with blue buff, but with the Sharpshooter buff, you definitely want to have Spear of Shojin. Sharpshooter buff gives your sharpshooters a ricochet on their auto attacks, which triggers on-hit effects, so Jinx is much more effective with these types of on-hit items such as Spear of Shojin. Also, I'm not gonna go into like Kalista Jhin because they don't use the mana items. However, if you guys have tried Mage Cap Kalista ever, let me know in the comments down below. Lily is a blue Shojin person. Chosen Lux is a blue Shojin person. And again, this means first cast is better for blue, second cast better for Shojin. Next up, we have Nami. She is better with blue buff when she doesn't have the Enlighten buff. And then if she does have the Enlighten buff, it doesn't matter which one you use. And then for all the Enlightened and Sharpshooter units, if I just list either and don't note what you should go when they have either of their traits, it just means that it's still whatever I listed there for all scenarios. Nidalee, without the Sharpshooter bonus, you could use either item. And then with Sharpshooter, obviously Shojin's going to be better. So for Talon, Talon's kind of a weird case. So blue buff technically casts faster for Talon without Enlightened and Talon with Enlightened. However, Spear of Shojin is going to be a much better item on Talon because you really benefit a lot from the attack damage. Just because of the way Talon works, his spell gets increased damage based on his attack damage, so you definitely want to build a Spear of Shojin on Talon over a blue buff, even though you might get more casts with a blue buff. For Teemo, it's either without buffs, and then with Sharpshooter is Shojin, same for Chosen Teemo. And then for Yone, Yone is another special case. Yone has 2 parts of his ability. The first one is called Sealed Fate, and this one requires a lot of mana, so Shojin's going to be really good for that. The second part of his ultimate, which is called Unforgotten, doesn't require much mana at all, which means blue buff is going to be better for him. So for all the exceptions, that's it. If you guys think that I missed one of these, let me know in the comments below, but let's get into how to decide which item to make when I list either for the champion. Oh, and just some assumptions for the table. Damage taken is not taken into account, and just because I put an item on this list does not mean I recommend this item for each of these champions. I'm merely comparing whether you should build blue buff or Shojin, and I'm not taking any other item into account. For example, I'm not recommending you to build Shojin on Shen. He probably wants tank items instead, but Shojin is better than blue buff, which is what this chart is supposed to dictate. So going back into the issues of when either is listed, there are a couple things to consider. Here's when I take into account taking damage for your spell cast. If a champion is prone to getting stunned and takes a ton of damage before their next spell cast, blue buff's going to be slightly better because they gain 20 mana from 0 auto attacks. So assuming we have a Sejuani with blue buff and a Sejuani with Shojin, if Sejuani gets perma-stunned in the front line if you're against a team with allowed crowd control, blue buff's going to be better because it's going to get you to your next cast faster, because Sejuani's not doing any auto attacks to gain mana. That's one thing to consider whenever you're thinking about putting a mana item on a tanky champion or someone who gets crowd controlled a lot. Next, depending on mana thresholds, one item might be better than the other. For example, in our Ahri scenario, it takes 5 autos for her first cast when equipped with either blue buff or Spear of Shojin. However, after 4 auto attacks, Shojin puts her at 75 out of 80 mana, meaning she only needs to gain 5 mana from taking damage to get her cast off, whereas blue buff, after 4 auto attacks, she'll merely be at 70 out of 80 mana, meaning she'll need to gain more mana from damage than had she had a Spear of Shojin. That means if Ahri gets hit by a Morgana ultimate, you might want Spear of Shojin over the blue buff. The last thing to consider is that Shojin adds auto attack damage, making it slightly favored for Shojin if everything else is the same. This means every auto attack you're getting in 15 more damage from the BF sword component, and therefore Shojin would be better in those scenarios. The last thing to consider is champions with Runon's Hurricane or effects that trigger on hit effects will generally prefer the Spear of Shojin over the blue buff because, again, you get the extra mana from the extra on-hit effect from something like a Runon's Hurricane. So that's pretty much it. I'll leave a link for this on the description below, but you could always access this on my website at bunnymuffins.lol. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is kind of the first item analysis that I've done, so let me know if you guys want to see more of these in the future, and if you have a specific request for what items I should analyze next, go ahead and leave that in the comments below as well. But yeah, apart from that, I'll see you guys next time.